See, I think one of the things we have to be first clear about, what are we looking for when we are looking for accountability? One can give a kind of formal definition of accountability where you say, look, an agent has been empowered on our behalf to do something for us, and we should have the power to sanction them if they don't do what they were supposed to do for us, right? But that definition doesn't get you very far, because the question is, how do you produce systems of accountability? Now, one thing I think we have to think about very clearly is accountability has lots of different aspects, right? By some people, accountability simply they mean accountability for outcomes. There are certain outcomes we are looking at, and we want those outcomes. Good health, better education, fast-growing economy. So we want to hold people accountable for those outcomes. Other aspects of accountability are more formal. You're looking at properties of institutions. Is the institution representative? Is it responsive? Is it efficient? Is it transparent? Right? Now, the difficult challenge in thinking about accountability is we tend to assume that all of these things go together. Right? So, representative system should be more transparent, should be more efficient, should be more responsive. The bad news is that all these good things don't often go together, right? So you can have a representative system, as a democracy at one level clearly is. I mean, there are issues about we can debate how representative it is, but it is representative in a certain sense. You can have representative institutions that are not very responsive. You can have transparent institutions that are not very efficient, right? You can have institutions which are sense responsive but not particularly efficient at producing outcomes that you want, because those outcomes depend on a whole range of other things, right? So I think it's important to not oversimplify the accountability debate by saying, accountability simply means punishment or transparency or something. These are all aspects of it, and I think the question is, in what context do particular things matter more? Now, for a democratic society, the way we normally think about the puzzle of India is that it is clearly a functioning democracy. Democracy has deep roots. There's a lot of political engagement by any global standards. India is a very politically engaged society. We've just had 85% turnout in West Bengal, right? Unlike other societies, it seems that the poor also come out to vote a lot more than elsewhere. So the accountability puzzle at a very high level of generality is posed as, look, how come we have a democratic society and yet it seems to produce a government that's not as responsive as we'd like it to be? That's one part of the second puzzle, which is in the news currently, is how come we produce governments that are corrupt and routinely rent-seeking as opposed to being responsive, right? Now let's take the first one first, which is, why is it that a democracy is not producing as responsive government as we would like to be? I think one preliminary clarification is that I think we need some clarity about what we mean by responsive government, because I think there's a tendency, particularly in ideological debates in India, to just draw blanket conclusions. All government is corrupt. All government doesn't work, right? The fact is there is enormous variation in government performance in India. There's enormous variation within the central government. You can think of some ministries that are doing splendidly well. There's enormous variation across states, right? So that we aren't looking at one single unified thing called government, which has the same problem every time, everywhere, right? The second thing I think we are in a sense looking at responsive government is that often you can have government that is responsive in the sense that it sincerely takes on board the welfare of the people. Its intentions are right, right? It may not even have high levels of rent seeking, but may actually not produce very much developmental outcomes, right? I mean, some would argue that actually that was the problem in the 50s and 60s, because you simply made a lot of wrong policy choices, even though you had all the other ingredients of an accountable government in place. Right now, the paradox is that you seem to have, a pretty bizarre institutional structure, coalition politics, rent seeking. And yet, for the first time in our history, there's a sense of possibility about this economy. There's a possibility that something can change, right? So I think these dynamics are much more variegated and complicated. Now, the first answer to the question of what is it that makes for accountable government in a democratic context would be, the boring old answer is you need more democracy, right? So that whenever you see limitations in the performance of government, it is often to do with more the fact that democracy is not deep enough. And in India in particular, I think the two dimensions of democratic deepening that are very important is, one is at what level of government are the decisions taken. Most people would argue that Indian government is way too centralized, and centralization intrinsically militates against accountability, because what it does is it fuses a large number of issues into one, and it blurs the distinctions between authority and responsibility, right? So that if you were to judge a central government, right, you can't disaggregate it too much. You have to judge it on some general sense of well-being, right? As opposed to saying, look, I'm judging my local representative on my schooling, on my water, right? So decentralization intrinsically allows disaggregation of a certain kind, which is why a lot of people think that decentralization has to be one important part of any institutional reform in India. It's not a sufficient condition, but it's certainly a necessary condition. The second, I think, dimension apart from decentralization, which I think is absolutely central to Indian democracy, is that there are fact that our political parties are not accountable structures. So the one way voters think about political parties is, yes, we are a democracy, but the menu is set for us by somebody else. We go and exercise choice once the menu is set, but there is no really open process by which the menu itself comes to be set, right? Most advanced democracies that experienced great progress in fighting corruption, in policy reform, that process was accompanied by a serious reform of the party system, and particularly some degree of intra-party democracy. Why is intra-party democracy important, right? The first reason it's important is because it lowers the entry barriers to politics, right? Right now, if there's a newly emerging group that wants to join a political party, or you want to contest a election, you don't know what the rules of the game are, right? How do I get the Congress ticket for Delhi, or how does so and so get the Congress ticket for Mirzapur, right? At the moment, it's some inchoate combination of the party leadership needs to like you, some decision maker somewhere, as opposed to having regular and predictable rules. If you don't have regular and predictable rules, there's actually very little incentive for new players to join this party. In fact, one of the reasons why the Indian party system became so weak, why you got this fragmentation, was because, let's say you were a newly rising social group, Dalits in the 90s in UP, Charan Singh's rich farmers in the middle peasants in the 1970s and 80s. You could have two political options. You could either say to yourself, let me join some existing political party and turn that political party to my political agenda. Or you could say, let me start my own political party. Now, you will not do the former unless you know what the rules of the game are. Tomorrow you join the party and the party leadership says, sorry, we don't like your face, right? So, even for creating good entry into politics, right, which is one of the big challenges we face because many people think the entry barriers to politics are too high, you need intra-party sort of democracy. The second thing that intra-party democracy does is that it also creates a form of decentralization because it allows particular politicians to be accountable to particular constituencies, right? So if I want to run from Delhi, I should be able to convince most of my party workers in Delhi that I'm the right candidate. And I'll be able to do that if I'm doing something that's tangible for them, as opposed to, no, I need to convince the party high command, which may decide on God knows what criteria I should be running, right? I mean, they may even be deciding on my intellect, which is not exactly the best reason why I should be given a ticket or somebody should be given a ticket, right? So political party reform is absolutely central to accountability because without that, the main conduit through which power is channeled in our society is the political party. And frankly, that conduit is very opaque, right? And closed off. So those are sort of two large institutional spaces that we need to look at in terms of political reform. Then there are other smaller things, right, which partake of the same theoretical logic in the sense that you can hold somebody accountable only if there's a clarity of the criteria around which you hold somebody accountable. Now think of the members of parliament, for example. I think MPs are some of the most marginalized people in our political system. We think of politicians as powerful, but how are they marginalized? Most members of parliament have to vote according to party whips all the time, which means as a voter, I have no way of judging the performance of a member of parliament, right? There's no distinguishing characteristic that they can bring, other than sort of some local roots or, what politicians are very good at. This is a politician who's attended every funeral in town or, occasionally brokered some deals, maybe got one project here, there, right? But systematically, we don't have a system where you can pick out the distinguishing characteristics of individual politicians, right? And so you need some small reforms like that. For example, making sure that party whips are not applicable to every piece of legislation. Then candidates could actually be judged on why did you vote for something. Right now, I can't even ask that question to my MP, right? Now, and the reason I'm pointing out the example of the MPs is because I think it's also a good case study of how accountability measures can have perverse consequences. So the reason we have this system is because we have a very strong anti-defection law, which was created to, as it were, some might say, enhance accountability in one way, right? Enhance accountability by saying that MPs should not be able to defect from their parties after they won election. They should not be horse trading on the floor in coalition governments. But the result of that anti-defection law was MPs lost all their individuality. As they lost all their individuality, right, their political calculus also becomes very different because they know there's nothing much they can do by way of individual characteristics that will help them win re-election. So their attention is elsewhere, right? So I think one set of issues we need to think about are these broad institutional spaces. And my worry is that I think in a lot of our debate over reform, we are actually not looking at these spaces as much.